Good morning. Welcome to session 12C, Governance, Policy, and Planning Around the World. My name is Michael Berger. I'm the Executive Director at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law here at Columbia Law School, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this panel this morning. We have 6 presentations that will take us around the world through a variety of case studies, theoretical perspectives, and practical policy frameworks. Please send any questions that you have as they arise through the Q&A or chat functions. We will have time for a brief Q&A after each presentation if there are questions at that time, and then we'll have time for a longer discussion after the conclusion of all of the presentations. We have a limited amount of time and a lot to say, so I'll, with that, turn it over to our first presenters, Marianne Wilson of Natural Resources Canada and Brent Doberstein of the University of Waterloo. Marianne and Brent.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share some information about some work we've been involved with. So I work with Natural Resources Canada. We lead a forum which brings together small stakeholders from across Canada to work on advancing adaptation action and pool our resources and expertise. So if you can move to slide 2. So one of the areas we identified as a priority is that we know little about managed retreat and how to do this in a Canadian context and to protect our communities and advance adaptation in a future context. So to address this gap, we commissioned a report working with Jevity Consulting and their team, and it's called Planned Retreat Approaches to Support Resilience to Climate Change in Canada. So we wanted to share some of the results today. And so if you move to slide 3, it just provides a snapshot of what the report entails. So our consulting team, Michael Bernard, Brent Doberstein, Patrick Saunders Hastings, brought excellent expertise. We worked with an advisory committee of over 25 experts from across Canada, conducted literature reviews, interviews, and case studies of 6 case studies from across Canada of various experiences. So the report overview is outlined there. I won't go into that because I really want to share and save our time for getting into the results. And I'm going to turn it over to Brent now to walk you through some of our findings. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. The key findings, and I'm just going to be able to highlight a few of these in the time that we have available. Firstly, we started with our literature review and came up with a definition that really influenced the rest of the report. Choosing very consciously the term planned retreat, and this is the purposeful movement of people, infrastructure, or land uses from areas at high risk of flooding, slope destabilization, storm surge, sea level rise, and other risks made worse by climate change to areas that are at lower risk or more resilient. And really, this report positions planned retreat in the context of longer term and proactive climate change adaptation. So you can see the graphic on the right-hand side, which we have consciously chosen to indicate as a circular process or an iterative process, beginning in the bottom right-hand side, firstly understanding climate change impacts, and then moving on to an assessment of vulnerabilities and risks. And then the part or the stage at which planned retreat potentially comes in is really the third stage, where we are identifying and selecting adaptation options to cope with the anticipated climate change and the vulnerabilities that are expected to emerge from climate change. So you can see on the left-hand side, this kind of four box column, which we're just referring to the para adaptation options framework, where when faced with the need to adapt for climate change, you can protect, you can accommodate, you can retreat, which is what this conference is really focusing on, or you can avoid. And then, once you've made those choices, and it could be a blend of choices, you then begin to implement your actions, monitor, and adjust over a long period of time, and potentially adjust in future iterative cycles. Our literature review and discussions with stakeholders and key informants really captured the current state of planned retreat in Canada. And the very first item that we derived, I guess, from this assessment was that typically planned retreat in Canada is very reactive to disasters. We are beginning in Canada to engage in proactive planned retreat, but we really are just at the beginning. And I'll pull out a couple of other snapshots from our search and our discussions. We really found a lack of standardization in different provinces, different territories, different cities that were facing planned retreat. There really was no standardized approach. And I think this really derives from another observation that various levels of government and different governments, provinces and territories are not aligned in their thinking about planned retreat. And so to put it crudely, everybody's doing their own thing. I'll skip down to terminology challenges. We really did find that there is resistance to terms like managed retreat, and this is why we landed on planned retreat, but there was no one term that all of the stakeholders that we consulted were happy with. So really, I think the key there is to use the terminology that your stakeholder group is familiar with and comfortable with. Skipping over onto the right-hand side, we really found that since about 2012, there is increased awareness across Canada of planned retreat as an option, and in some cases support for that approach. So this provides a window of opportunity for the future. Now I'm going to go ahead to the next slide here, which is really one of the main focuses of this report was trying to identify good practices. And again, we very consciously decided not to choose the term best practices because again, there really is no common understanding or agreement about practices that are best in the context of planned retreat. So we watered that down a little bit to good practices, and you can see that we broke these out into 3 different categories: communication, governance, and the actual process of planned retreat. So just getting into this a little bit, the good practices that we've identified related to communication surrounding planned retreat for climate change adaptation. Number 1, or perhaps very importantly, choosing terminology very carefully. And as I've already mentioned, working with stakeholders and communities to decide what terminology are they comfortable with. You don't want to choose a terminology that really sets off opposition at the very beginning, or over time, terminology may change, and you must be prepared to change with that, with the comfort levels. The second good practice related to communication is climate change adaptation. Certainly at the beginning of a process involves a lot of brainstorming and a lot of search for different options. So what we're recommending here is don't be afraid to include planned retreat as an option, even though you may think that the community may not be fully comfortable with that as an option. Put it on the table, at least at the beginning. And because we know climate change adaptation is an iterative or a cyclical process, you may find that the first time planned retreat is on the table, it's rejected. Or even the second iteration, it may also be rejected. But over time, conditions are changing. And so there may come a time when planned retreat is seen as a viable option. I'm going to skip over onto the right-hand, whoops, that advanced on its own. I'm going to skip onto the right-hand side, communicating early and often and involving the community and basically multiple stakeholders, which we've captured by the word everybody. And also putting planned retreat in the context of adaptation. We often think of retreat as a disaster-related reactive approach, but I think it's really time to change the narrative and try and put planned retreat in the context of proactive, future-oriented adaptation. Our second category of best good practices, governance. It's very important to pick a leader or multiple leaders and champions that you feel can adequately represent the planned retreat option. let alone champion that for the long term. And you may need multiple leaders. You may need leaders at different levels and champions at different levels that are able to promote or at least put the planned retreat option on the table. There are often a lot of fears about the loss of the tax base. If community members are going to be leaving that community as a form of retreat, then of course municipal leaders are worried about their bottom line, the tax base. And so it's important to consider the issue of the tax base and try to incorporate that with planned retreat discussions. Over on the right-hand side, I think what we found most importantly across all of the good practices, and it was hard to decide where to put this, communities should decide. Really, communities are at the heart of planned retreat discussions. And so it's critically important to involve communities at the start and throughout the process of planned retreat discussions and climate change adaptation generally. I'm going to go ahead to the final good practice here, which is process. Really, what are the procedures and the processes that, that you follow when having discussions of climate change adaptation and related planned retreat? Certainly, we think about climate change adaptation as a very long-term process, and the planned retreat portion of that process can often take a significant amount of time. So starting early, starting before we begin to see the disaster effects or the impacts of hazards on a community. Starting when you can begin to foresee those impacts, but not necessarily experience them. And a lot of municipalities are very challenged to take on climate change adaptation and planned retreat on their own. And so I think part of our good practice process elements here are really to enable municipalities to seek outside help. Universities, consulting agencies, grant agencies, certainly academics and researchers. Mobilize additional institutions and individuals that can help with that process. And again, it's advancing on its own. I'm just going to go back one second here. Maybe the final comment here is talking about the health implications of climate change adaptation and planned retreat. There are significant physical and mental health elements related to planned retreat, and that should always be kept in mind when considering this as a climate change adaptation option. You can build in supports for mental health for communities that are going through planned retreat or considering that. And certainly understanding this at the start of the process will make it easier in the medium and the longer term. So I'm just going to, at the end of my time here, point you to the links where you can download this report, approximately 70 pages, as we play out over a short video of one of our case studies, Erie Shore Drive in Lake Erie last November during a winter storm. Okay, I've reached the end of my 12 minutes, so I'm going to stop sharing here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brent. Thank you so much, Marianne, for that fascinating presentation on your work in Canada. Now we're going to turn things over to Limgreeley from the University of Sydney, and Liam is going to talk about slow abandonment as managed retreat. Liam?
You've got my screen? That's all good? Great. I'll take it as yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Limgreeley from the University of Sydney. Debates on managed retreat have predominantly focused on coastal or riverine contexts, featuring rising sea levels and land loss, and on planning processes to deliberately relocate communities elsewhere. This paper attempts first to consider the applicability of this framework to arid contexts in Central Australia, where First Nations communities will continue to be inhabited. Even as those contexts heat up, water becomes more scarce, the state reduces its investment, and forms of temporary mobility increase. Climate and infrastructural vulnerabilities in Australia are not specific to remote communities or indigeneity, but it is in remote Indigenous communities that the politics of policy on climate adaptation and infrastructural renewal shifts to the question of viability. Second, this paper aims to use managed retreat scholarship to consider policies that are variously explicit in their goals for retreat, but which nonetheless affect that outcome. This aims to identify policy that coheres through state withdrawal and non-acknowledgement rather than explicit naming. As a planner's discourse, managed retreat seeks coherent and just responses to forms of climate-related displacement. But the state can also manage retreat by stealth, negligence, or inattention. And this discourse offers potential to reassess the trajectories that such non-policies engender according to criteria for effective and just planning. I work in the Housing for Health incubator, where our focus always begins with a version of the questions: what is required to deliver the housing and infrastructure needed by residents in a particular case, mostly remote contexts? And what are the impediments to its provision established within policy worlds? Today, this question is repurposed as how to characterise the slow withdrawal of Australian government's support for homelands and its impact on residents' retreat from such contexts. I restrict my focus here to homelands to consider a particular policy form of slow withdrawal as managed retreat, which may require some contextualisation for international audiences. So in the Northern Territory, the jurisdiction where I live, there are 18 gazetted towns and 73 prescribed remote Aboriginal communities. Although it comprises 18% of Australia's landmass, the Northern Territory has a population of only 246,000 people, of whom 30% are Indigenous, as compared with 3.3% of the national population. The category remote community is both geographic and governmental, determined by the relative proximity of communities to service centres and policy histories that have formalised relationships between Aboriginal communities and Commonwealth government investment. Homelands, also known as outstations, the tiny dots in this map, are typically satellite settlements to remote communities, usually located on their residents' ancestral country. There are about 600 homelands in the Northern Territory, servicing about 10,000 residents intermittently and as permanent dwellings. This distinction between remote communities and homelands has material ramifications. In a recent project on the APY lands in the state of South Australia, so still Central Australia, but south of the border, a context experiencing significant increases in heat and seasonal migration to proximate regional centres, colleagues and I examined the property maintenance program undertaken across APY lands communities. Among property maintenance programs in remote Australia, this one is gold standard. Where most programs are reactive and underfunded, Housing SA run a planned maintenance program in which 10 visits by tradespeople are scheduled each year to proactively maintain housing hardware. 377 houses across 10 communities allocated about $10,000 each per annum. In contrast, a total of $200,000 is available per year for all homelands housing across the APY lands region. This is expended in limited and ad hoc ways, and homelands housing is in relative states of disrepair with no funds available for replacement stock. That any funds are available for homelands repairs is not a specific policy of the South Australian government, where a recently published 10-year strategy for Aboriginal housing fails to mention homelands. Back in the Northern Territory, we can similarly consider this withdrawal through the Homelands Extra Allowance. Under this policy, residents living permanently on homelands can apply for $8,000 per annum to upgrade their home. Interviews I conducted in 2018 with employees of homelands resource centres demonstrated markedly different approaches to implementing this allowance. One services officer noted that he spent about half his time completing the administrative requirements of the scheme so that remote residents could access this discretionary funding. I asked a manager of a different resource centre whether this scheme created an administrative burden for him too, but he simply noted that it didn't, quote, because tenants have to come in and ask for it. While easy to condemn the manager for some moral failing, the key issue is that funding for homelands housing is made discretionary, subject to eligibility conditions, and is unknown and difficult to access for many remote residents. This is not the case for remote community housing, despite its many shortcomings. In the Northern Territory, the distinction between remote community and homelands housing is differently meaningful today than it was in the mid-2000s. In 2007, under the guise of a child sexual abuse scandal, Australia's Commonwealth Government announced the Northern Territory National Emergency Response, or the intervention. While widely remembered for the spectacle of Australia's military descending on remote communities, the intervention's main legacy was the acceleration of a revolution in remote leasing. After compulsorily acquiring leases to remote communities and numerous town camps, the Commonwealth Government then demanded that traditional owners formalise leasing arrangements with the Northern Territory Government prior to any provision of federal funding for remote housing and infrastructure. The Aboriginal community housing sector was largely replaced by a Northern Territory Government-run public housing system, but without a township or housing precinct lease, no new houses or maintenance services would be provided. This was significantly different to the system that existed prior to the intervention. From the early 1970s, Australian government policy shifted from assimilation to Aboriginal self-determination and involved a significant emphasis on returning to country through land rights and the homelands movement, a managed retreat, if you like, from former missions and related pastoral institutions. Supported by grants from the Commonwealth Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the former ATSIC, and new Aboriginal corporations and homelands resource centres, housing and essential services infrastructures were built on country from which First Nations people had been removed generations earlier. While housing was modest and maintenance perennially underfunded, the self-determination era is distinguished from today by the governmental question of homeland's viability. This is evident implicitly through the gradual reduction of homelands funding and explicitly through policies that encouraged Aboriginal people to centralise and sedentarise at larger regional centres, such as the former Territory Growth Towns policy. Nonetheless, the Northern Territory Government recently commissioned a review of its homelands policy as recognition to the ongoing demand of Indigenous residents to renew funding support for homelands. The government agreed with most recommendations of that review, including the establishment of a new body to manage homelands policy that includes Aboriginal land councils. However, the government has been criticised for failing to provide any commitment to new homelands housing. The Commonwealth Government has effectively withdrawn funding support for Northern Territory homelands in the form of a Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2007 and walk-away funding in 2015 that obliged the Territory Government to take full responsibility for delivering municipal and essential services. The Territory Government is now unlikely to build new housing itself, both for the capital costs involved and because the logic of remote leasing has saturated governmental thinking. That is, no new assets are provided without leases that clearly establish liability for ongoing maintenance, and no leases will be sought by government for homelands with a legacy of historical assets and inattention to them establishes unappealing inheritances. This confluence of policy underpins a situation that displaces homelands residents, as Rob Nixon writes, not by relocating them, but by, quote, leaving communities in a place stripped of the very characteristics that made it inhabitable. As houses disassemble, accelerated by undersupply, crowding, and inadequate funds for repairs and maintenance, residents are more likely to move from homelands to remote communities and regional centres, whether or not they are incentivised or supported by explicit growth towns policies. This is slow withdrawal as managed retreat. It's not abandonment as total state withdrawal, but it's the reprioritisation of geographies and the rearrangement of state resources. It's tacit withdrawal rather than explicit policy, and is akin in various ways to related concepts like organised abandonment, slow violence, and slow disaster. Slow withdrawal, specifically, highlights the ways that ratcheting up the attrition of funding over time gradually exacerbates the difficulties associated with remaining on country and the pressures on residents to move elsewhere for adequate housing, despite the advantages homelands offer to cultural continuity and familial connection. So to conclude, this is a very early sketch of ideas I'm developing further in relation to both remote community contexts where water scarcity is impeding government's willingness to build new housing despite the need, and where increased heat for longer periods combines with inadequate housing to increase temporary mobility or seasonal mobility from remote to regional centres. This is slow withdrawal as a form of managed retreat that is currently unnamed in Australian policy. Acknowledging how existing forms of disinvestment and neglect tacitly contribute to demographic shifts is necessary to even begin developing climate adaptive infrastructural and mobility strategies that are self-determined and self-managed, with an emphasis on facilitating remote residents to remain on country as desired. Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. So next up, we will hear from Thomas Thaler at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences. And Thomas will be presenting on his paper, Just Retreat, How Different Countries Deal with It, examples from Austria and England. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you very much. There we go, the classical problem. So hopefully you can see my presentation. No. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from my side. Thank you very much, Mike, for the nice introduction. Now we are flying from Australia to Europe, which I would like to present you a case study or some research which I conducted a couple of months ago. It's more likely results of two projects, and the paper was recently published in Journal of Environmental Studies and Science. What is the issue or the problem? What we know it's that the overall conference we're talking about is what is managed retreat. Usually I have to speak much more about what I understand on the managed retreat or what is planned relocation or resettlement, because managed retreat is not the most famous and favorite flood risk management policy worldwide, neither by the policymaker, as we know, neither by the citizen, as some picture showing you from Austria, where citizens were not really happy about the situation, why they should move away from the floodplain area, and why they don't get any other technical mitigation measures. Managed retreat, and that's also the key core of this conference, is it's not only linked to governance and management, it has highly influenced by environmental, social, and climate justice. And what I assessed a little bit more in detail is the question about how is social justice linked to managed retreat and how especially social justice might influence managed retreat in terms of participation, that's procedural justice, as everyone knows. As the previous presenter said about recognition justice is a core issue, particularly if we talk about First Nation communities, minority groups, deprived communities, but also we often forget about distributional justice, the question about how you get compensated or maybe you don't get compensated at all. The aim of the study or the aim of the paper was actually saying what I wanted to know is such as like taking this theoretical junk or this theoretical work, what we understand about social justice and how this different social justice philosophy schools, which is implemented by different countries across the globe, actually is influencing managed retreat in terms of planning, management, and implementation, also modes of governance. So it means like, okay, I wanted to know which theory, so justice theory, might be used by the countries in Europe and what would be the outcome. As you know, there is a wide range of theoretical implications about what does social justice means, how you can understand social justice, how you can define social justice, what are the political implications, and I spot here only 4 of them, and I would like not to go into much detail because I don't have really time, is social justice has different meaning. That's not something surprising. For example, we have some groups or people that are saying, well, social justice means more likely that the market is organizing this whole liberalism, also from an Austrian guy, August von Hayek, really promoting this issue, saying, well, the market should organize managed retreat, not the state. Or we have also other understanding what managed retreat should look like, such as like we focus on the most vulnerable group. But often what means vulnerable groups is not really defined. Or another issue might be the first concept, the utilitarianism, saying, well, we use management retreat because it's cheaper, or to create or provide more welfare to the community, to the society, if we remove certain spots, usually low-income families or deprived communities, then provide them with technical mitigation measures. So quite harsh understanding, but this is a classical cost-benefit ratio. What I try to understand this is not only one on a single country, but to understand a little bit on two different countries. Yes, it's still Europe. Yes, Brexit might play something, but in fact, these two countries, this one is in Austria, it's in Central Europe, and dealing with managed retreat on the riverside, and the other one is the English and Welsh managed retreat policy, which is mainly focused on the coastal area. Why these two countries? The main reason is they are totally different. English has this common law, Austria has this Roman law. We have different understanding about when we should use cost-benefit analysis and flood risk management, but also a different understanding how to manage flood risk management. Managed retreat is in both countries not something new. For example, in Austria, we're using this for at least the last 50 years. Of course, it's entirely voluntary, and it's mainly in the Danube regions where they manage more than 600 households to move away from the floodplain area. In England, it's slightly different. It's more likely on the coast. It started in the 70s, 80s. It's also often called a rollback policy, which means, okay, we have to organize something, but we organize something that means people have to move away from the coast. But both countries, and that's the usual sense, and that's why I always need to spend much more time about talking why we need to plan retreat. This is often the last option by both countries. It's not really the most favorite issue because it's too much political problematic for both countries. So how does it look like in both countries? So it's a managed retreat in both countries. Is first of all, it's a question about when they're using managed retreat. One is decided actually to remove one single house in the floodplain area. And that's quite interesting. Both countries have a totally different understanding. In Austria, for example, they don't use any cost-benefit analysis to organize managed retreat. Now, many people would be shocked, but yeah, we still have countries in Europe where they don't use for each risk management strategy cost-benefit analysis. In Austria, it's much more like a political, top-down, often hydrological debate which community or which buildings you would like to retreat or not. And often they are not really surprising in the countryside, in the rural areas. The other hand, in England and Wales, they're really harsh on it and say, well, we need to use cost analysis for all our risk management strategies. And for example, if a community shows a negative or low cost-benefit ratio, that means the government is doing nothing. So what is actually happening in England and Wales is if the cost-benefit analysis is not fine, they don't provide any technical mitigation measures. And what they're saying to the people say, well, you get no support, no protection, so organize it yourself. You can't stay, but you also can move away most of the time. In Austria, it's different. If to use managed retreat, then there is a clear legal compensation level. It means 80% of the building value, 80% of the demolition costs are compensated by the government. The rest have to organize by the homeowners, and the homeowners or property owners in that case still own the ground. So it's not like a buyout, what you can see in the States. What are actually the social justice implications? Really briefly and hard is saying, well, first of all, in Austria, what is the decision-making process? Yes, it is somehow like an utilitarian approach. That means if the Austrian government, here in this case, the national and regional authorities, decide to relocate an area, they provide or decide or argue that is the greatest to improve the welfare of the society. The level of compensation is a very egalitarian approach. Everyone gets this 80%. So there is no nuances, for example, for most vulnerable groups or deprived communities, no, they get everything the same. What we've seen is from a previous study is that some people are really struggling to remove because they don't get enough compensation, so they cannot always buy a new apartment or new buildings. So what is seen is that in Austria is that sometimes they overlook these ethical dilemmas because I'm saying, well, everyone got the same, but we are not going too much in detail to make a difference between them, which means that some groups are more struggling with these management treat issues. In the English way, it's something, as I already said, a little bit different. Is again this strong utilitarian approach using cost-benefit ratio analysis. That means no positive cost-benefit ratio, no mitigation measure. So people need to do more likely what they do. That means also that it's a very market-driven liberalism approach. That is compensation. There's actually no compensation by the government. So if you have some financial savings, you're fine. If you have no financial savings, and that's largely the problem in England, English and Welsh coastal area, there are quite a lot of deprived communities. So there's a high social vulnerability over there, and they get actually no support by the government. So to conclude a little bit, because we have many presenters and no time, is how it looks like in these two different countries. In fact, both countries using similar justification why we need managed retreat or why we implement managed retreat with slightly different nuances, but main difference are the implementation and the compensation process about managed retreat in both countries. The Austrian approach is trying much more like an egalitarian approach and saying, okay, everyone gets treated the same way. We try somehow to support certain people, but we don't have specific legal regulations that, for example, support the most vulnerable groups or not. The other hand, the English and Welsh way is much more harsher and saying, well, we need a much more liberal approach because if people stand there and building their house and we cannot protect them, they have to organize everything by themselves. In fact, if you're looking about the success rates, we've seen that in Austria, of course, much more buildings were removed and rebuilt somewhere else in compared to the English and Welsh situation. And that's the main reason also in Austria, because they get quite a high compensation level in compared to many other countries across the globe. So social justice, does it matter? Of course it matters. There's also the core topic of this conference. But where does it actually matter? It's, in fact, everywhere in management retreat, but in particular what I analyzed was why we use managed retreat is highly influenced by the social justice philosophy of a country and a great different understanding and definition which buildings needs to remove or not, how we plan it also in terms of participation. As already the first presenter mentioned quite clearly, we need to engage, but it's not everywhere across the globe that they're engaging quite closely with the communities. How we manage it in terms also after the agreement is signed, such as like how to organize the rebuilding recovery phase. For example, both countries have no implication. And the last question is also how to compensate it. Should we compensate it? And how much we need to compensate. So each of the countries, and I'm pretty sure if you're looking outside of Europe, different countries will have different understanding about what means social justice to them, will highly influence managed retreat. And therefore, my overarching goal would be we need much more knowledge, information, evidence about how does social justice, how does the different social justice philosophy, theory, and policy in each country are actually influencing managed retreat. And my dream would be that we might work together, and particularly I need your help to get much more evidence and tissue information on that issue, because at the moment I have two countries in Europe, but what we're really interested to see how different countries are outside of Europe, but also inside of Europe, are actually dealing with this question and how to manage it. I would like to say thank you very much, and let's go to the next presenter.
Thomas, thank you so much for that presentation. Quick reminder to those listening in and watching these presentations, please do file your questions in the chat or question and answer function on the Zoom. This will allow us to have a robust conversation that's directly responsive to, the things that are on your mind following the presentations. So please do file your questions. All right, so turning to our next presenters, we will hear from Andrew Fuys and Sangita Das of the Church World Service, who will be talking about their work moving toward resilience, attitudes and perceptions of pros and cons of migration and in-place adaptation in rural communities facing climate impacts. Take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Fuys, and I serve as Senior Director for Global Migration with Church World Service. Very pleased to be here along with my colleague Sangita Das in this conference and in this session. CWS is a faith-based humanitarian organization. We're just celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. We work with community partners around the world to respond to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. And late last year, we began an effort to learn systematically about how perceptions of climate change, migration, and adaptation are related in 5 countries where we're working: Cambodia, Georgia, Haiti, Indonesia, and Kenya. We're doing this alongside our support to livelihoods activities and to more resilient livelihoods in communities, rather than doing it as standalone research. We're doing this to improve our work on adaptation and disaster risk reduction so that our partnerships can better reflect diverse needs, emerging demands within our communities where we're working. And we're also doing this to try to learn more what are ways that we can support people in staying safe, in organizing for dignity and for rights for people who are on the move, particularly people who are on the move where climate is one of the factors. We've used qualitative methods, including interviews, focus groups, and we've sought to identify the patterns and perceptions behind responses, recognizing from the broader literature that climate change can be one factor in migration, but typically is not the only factor in migration. Our core team has included at least 15 colleagues, probably more at various points, from 7 countries where we're working. And we've worked as a group to develop the tools, to coordinate with community partners, to collect the data, to code data within locations, to build out findings within locations and across locations, to reach back to communities and start listing out recommendations and discussing those recommendations. You'll see we've done community report back workshops. Those have just taken place this month. So while we didn't use participatory methods in the research, we've included this to definitely have a co-production component in terms of identifying and naming recommendations coming out from the study. The data collection began a couple months ago in February. Our teams have conducted one-to-one interviews with more than 210 persons in the 5 countries. We've also done more than 24 focus groups, key informants where we've been able to reach mostly local government officials from village representative institutions and from local line ministry representatives. We're now incorporating the feedback from the community workshops into our draft report, and we hope to have a public version of the whole study available probably in the next month or 2. And we'll be making summaries, at least of the country summaries, and a snapshot of the overall findings available in the national languages in countries where we've been working. So let me now turn it over to Sangita for the next part.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Could you go to the slide mode, please, so that we can see it full screen? Thank you. So the first snapshot is from Kitui County of Kenya. It's located in arid and semi-arid lands of southeastern Kenya. And people have been experiencing unpredictable rainfall, extreme heat, longer dry seasons, shorter wet seasons, and these have been affecting the land and eventually the agriculture of these areas. The adaptation strategies have been mostly around water access and resilient farming adaptations. There are people who are taking up casual jobs or starting small businesses to make up for the deficit in the income caused by the loss of yield. The county level, at the county level, there are some sort of planning strategies regarding these changes, but there is a very strong budget limitations. In terms of migration, people are migrating. There's a lot of movement in the study areas. Kitui is kind of located between Nairobi. I mean, there's Nairobi on one side and Mombasa on the other side. So a lot of people go to the urban areas for jobs, increased income. That's what they have told us. But there are also people who go to other villages in search of better land. But it is generally not, I mean, they did not mention this as an adaptation strategy when we asked that question, but it came out in our conversation that they are doing it in whatever scale. So to summarize, it touches families' lives, but is not perceived as a climate coping strategy because because of, I mean, there is a perception of high costs here, although they did not seem to know exactly how much, uncertainty and lack of information and place attachment. So the recommendations that came out from our focus group discussions and workshops is better irrigation system, agricultural techniques, and so on. And of course, there is an interest in information and awareness on migration. Next slide, please. So the other snapshot is from Battambang province of Cambodia. Here also, people have been experiencing unpredictable weather, irregular and intense rainfall. There are disasters like floods and also storms. They are intensifying with time. I mean, all of these changes, they're causing water scarcity, land is dry and unproductive, and summer is longer and hotter, they have been telling us. And all these cause food shortage, and there are impacts on health. And also the forests are decreasing. That's also another thing they're very worried about. The adaptation strategies are basically focused on water sources. They're digging and deepening the ponds, storing rainwater, or purchasing water for consumption. CWS has been supporting rehabilitation of canals. So that is actually a big focus there. Many respondents had migrated for work because after losing the yield, they needed an extra source of income, and often they'd not really, I mean, without having any other way, they end up borrowing money. So to clear the debts, they eventually migrate to other parts of the country or across the border to Thailand, where they work and earn money if everything goes well. So the general perception of migration is basically for work and income, although if you continue looking along that line, it actually originated by losing what they were trying to grow. So some preference is there to stay close to home, place attachment, around which there's a lot of research recently from around the world. So it's there. But the general perception is that if you are landless or land poor, migration is what you do because you don't have any other way. Even though there are positive changes, like paying debts, there are also cases of work right abuses or threats or danger or imprisonment. So the general recommendations that came out was around how people can be made aware of the situations, and they can learn about safe migration, because they can so that they can take an informed decision when there is such a need or a case. And of course, for in-place adaptation, there is a need for investment in water access, need for resilient crops. And many people mentioned about early warning system for disasters because they're intensifying and increasing. Thank you.
Thanks, Sangita. One thing we're learning is that it's important to listen to someone's whole story to get a sense of whether and how climate impacts are part of that story, and also how they might be related to perceptions about mobility, about moving or not moving. Sharing here a few illustrative quotations. On the left, the top one is from Cambodia, the bottom one is from Kenya, and these show how there's a few different factors that are at play. Both in perceptions that seem to be favorable towards migration and perceptions that seem to be favorable towards remaining in place. On the right, a couple from Haiti, from one interview and one of the focus groups, which may be illustrative, not just of how people are perceiving the factors, but also how this is expressed. The top one, I picked up on the phrase misery trying to kill me and my children. Which sounds very much like the way someone would express subjective fear in an asylum claim, but the fear is coming from a different source. Also, in the one at the bottom on tipping points, this came out of one of the focus groups. The sense that there's a lot that's contributing to human insecurity. The most recent impacts of climate change, and this was also from an island area that's experiencing sea level rise on top of impacts on water access. This is convincing people that mobility is really the only option out. A few reflections in terms of planning and policy that we're considering for our own work with communities. Sangita mentioned we heard migration described as a coping strategy in some places, not in all places, and also by some people in those locations, but not by everybody. Where we did hear it described, I think we definitely heard that there's a strong demand for information, reliable, accurate information about migration. People aren't looking to receive messaging, not looking to be convinced whether to move or not, but to have information that could help them make very difficult decisions that involve risk management, that require thoughtful preparation. So we're looking at how we might be able to respond to that. There were some recommendations to make info desks available through local government offices, or through local community-based organizations. We might also consider whether we can weave information about migration, especially safe and regular migration, into the existing resilience activities, since that's already a touch point with communities. And then finally, in terms of asking about mobility, there seemed to be a value in doing that, even where the path led us back to really doubling down on investing in adaptations in place, in part because by asking about both staying and moving as if both ought to be rights that people enjoy, I think we were able to hear more sharply what people need to bring to life the right to stay. And these are long-term investments in access to water, investments in resilient agriculture, in affordable credit and community-based finance, disaster risk reduction, where communities are participating, in access to information about climate action. So there seemed to be a value in having mobility as part of our frame for designing in place adaptation, and that it really shifts away from maybe a reflection on what it would take for people not to move, and instead focuses on what do people really want and need to stay and to thrive where they are. I think I'm at time, so let me stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Sangita, for that perspective and those case studies. We'll move on to our next presenter, and I'll just drop another reminder to please do log your questions in the Q&A or chat functions. Next, we'll hear from Kanako Iuchi of Tohoku University, who will be presenting on a co-authored paper that they prepared with John Mutter of Columbia University. And this is exploring the potential of a community co-design framework to address equitable community relocation. Kanako?
Yes. Hello. Am I sharing the screen all right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. So as we are going around the world, my talk will be based on cases in Asia, namely from Japan, Philippines, and Indonesia, which I will be explaining in detail as we go along. So just a little bit about background of community relocation. And by now we know, everybody knows that the community relocation has a notorious reputation as it disrupts social networks. And with that, you're talking more about involving communities, and that is a key to a successful relocation. However, we don't really have any institutional mechanism or successful planning procedure on community relocation. We do sort of know that the community co-design is an important element to include in this relocation, because there is a symbiotic relationship between physical environment and community identity and relationship. And community co-design process is not new, but we know that it can be leveraged for better creativity. So I have been working on community relocation research for more than a decade. And as I know more about community relocation, I get the question, how could community involvement create better relocation outcomes? And in this specific talk today, I would like to address, to ask, to what extent does community co-design in the post-disaster recovery phase result in increased satisfaction with relocation outcomes? And how can it be leveraged to ensure communities affected by environmental change to rebuild better? My cases are from Asia that has already gone through community relocation after disasters. And one is from Tohoku, Japan, that's been affected by 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, which had the 10th year anniversary this March. The second one is the Typhoon Yolanda in 2013 in Leyte province in the Philippines. The third one is the Jakarta, Indonesia, after Mount Merapi volcanic eruption. And so I've spent considerable time trying to understand the relocation dynamics in these cases. And in this talk, we analyze the data by using that data that's been collected through the studies that I've done through interviews, participant observation, and informal conversation. And when analyzing community co-design in relocation, we decided to look at the three lenses. The first lens is the co-design setting. In particular, how is a relocation program has been designed of the ownership of the relocation sites as well as its houses. And we also look at the ownership of relocation project, who owns the project. The second lens is the co-design processes. In particular, trying to understand how actors involved in relocation participate, and then how those participating share information. And third lens was the outcomes, to see the sense of ownership and satisfaction levels of the residents who are actually relocating, and also trying to look at the housing design as the outcome for the physical outcome. The first case that I'll be explaining directly into is from Tohoku in Kesenuma City. And this is one of the most government-led process among three cases that I'll be explaining. The relocation site is owned by the local government. They own the land, and then the resident will be renting or purchasing land to construct houses on the lot that they will be provided. And the local government is central to the project as a mediator, translate the national government's recovery intention and residents' needs. And also they are the project owner. They make final decisions on site layouts, designs, and funding. And then they are the project driver, seeking support from professional and experts when needed. In that kind of settings, the resident participated the project as participants. They attended meetings to receive information from the local government. They identified needs and communicate to government sometimes, and they also negotiated with other residents on lots, but they participated as participants. Local governments were the one who incorporate resident idea to design site with the support of consultants. And in that setting and process, the resident could not play a large role on site design and development. As a result, residents had little sense of ownership, and then everywhere after relocation, they lost a local character on housing design of how it used to be. And there were sometimes disruption in community relationship. The second case is from Tacloban City in Leyte province. This is also government-led process, but the settings is a little bit different from the Tohoku's case, that the local government initially owned land, and then the national government and the nonprofits were responsible for procuring houses. But residents were sure from the beginning that they would be receiving or purchasing houses and land, that they knew that they were going to have it. Local government in the process did the project as they needed to talk to the national government, regional government, and also communities. But they were more like a coordinator. And what was different from Tohoku was that residents was active participants during construction. The national government has a program called Sweat Equity Program, which provides the government providing materials that are needed for construction. And then the resident will be contributing to the construction activities through hours, and which will be offset a portion of the housing costs. And so the resident played direct role in construction. And also while they were working, they had direct access to information on what was going on. National government and NGOs were the funders to construct housing units. And what also unique was that it was unique for local governments and NGOs helping communities to organize and also reestablishing livelihood. As a result, the outcome's a little bit different, that they had greater sense of ownership, and then a little bit unique in a sense of how the housing turned out to be as a result that you can see in the picture. The third case from Jakarta in Indonesia was most community-led process. The setting was different also, that the community owned the land, and then residents know that they will be owning the house from the beginning. And that was due to the program that's been developed by the national government called Recompact Program, where it intends to put residents in the center of decision making. And so communities is a project owner, making decision on every step. They're the project driver, exploring support from outside professional and experts when needed. And national and regional governments were there, but then playing supportive role, preparing funds, policies, and guidance. And so, because with the program setting, residents were the center of rebuilding decision all the time. They selected and designed the site. They designed the housing units. They identified neighborhood infrastructure. And they asked for help to facilitator who's been dispatched from the national government and specialists as they needed. So residents were included in every step of the relocation process. As a result, there developed a greater sense of ownership and negligible social disruption. And then you can also see in the picture, the housing design turned out to be unique, reflecting the local culture. Very quickly, the comparing three cases, we can see that less the community is reliant on government, more the sense of ownership, and more the local culture on housing design. So want to say three things as a conclusion. Successful community co-design process leads to greater satisfaction and less socially disruptive results. And it will also result unique housing design and function. Secondly, what I want to underscore is the way how co-design is initially arranged set a trajectory for community relocation process, For example, arrangement of land tenure and ownership affects incentives to participate in the process. And lastly, key elements in equitable community relocation are: one, having communities in the center of all decisions. Second, involve residents in every step of the process is important. And experts and governments should be there, but then be more of the reachable supporters. So this is the end of my slide. And if you have any question, please.
Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to just go ahead and move on to our final presenter, and then share some. We'll have some time at the end for a group discussion. So our last presenter today is Hebe Nicholson from the University of St. Andrews, and Hebe will be presenting on their paper "Resistance, Acceptance, and Misalignment of Goals in Climate-Related Resettlement in Malawi." Hebe, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. Let me just get my screen set up. Apologies. There's been a bit of an issue here. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, that's not allowing me to share my screen. Would you be able to put on the file that you have there? Sorry.
Autumn, I'm going to have to ask you to step in on this one. Can you give us a hand?
Yes, one moment.
Please bear with us as we deal with these technical difficulties.
Is that working now? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, apologies, sorry. Okay. Well, hello everyone, my name is Hebe Nicholson. It's great to be here and to be able to share this research with you. Sorry about the technicalities. So similar to what we were just hearing about the importance and difficulty of including those impacted within managed resettlement or relocation or retreat, or the terminology that we're using. My research is exploring the alignment of priorities and goals within resettlement, managed resettlement in Malawi. And I particularly focus on the Lower Shuri region of Malawi, which you can see in this photo here. This is an area in the far south of Malawi, and it has always had annual flooding and is subsequently a very fertile and highly populated area. But the flooding in this area is becoming increasingly severe, and there is more movement by people within this area and a growing interest from government to manage this movement and to form established resettlement programs within this area to manage the flooding. And this fits in with the kind of broader move that we've seen in the literature, with a shift to focus on environmental migration as adaptation, and the subsequent resettlement guidelines that we've seen coming up. So to conduct this research, I carried out interviews and focus groups with 3 communities that had 3 different outlooks on resettlement. So there were those which were resisting resettlement, and they're the box at the bottom of this small map here in Tienachakadza. And then there were those at the top of this map here, the top screen, in Village Malija, that were undecided, had the option to resettle but weren't sure. And then there were those in the middle box at Jumbo Resettlement Area, which had resettled after severe flooding in 2015. And I conducted these interviews in 2017. And on top of the community interviews, I also undertook 20 interviews with stakeholders in NGOs and government. And what I found was that within each community, there was specific issues that came up as to why the resettlement was not either occurring or not successful. And I found it interesting to place the situation of the government resettlement next to the existing movements or unplanned movements that were related to flooding that happened kind of organically within the communities. I don't really have enough time to go into that in this presentation, but I wanted to touch on it a bit and share it with you. So in Village Malija, this is a community that, as I said, has an option to resettle. They've had an area of land allocated to them by the government and the assistance promised from an NGO. But the problem which is holding it up seems to be a miscommunication. So when you speak to village members, they say they're waiting on the NGO to come and help. And then you speak to the NGO and they say, oh, we're waiting for the village members to make a decision. And I think part of the reason why there's been this miscommunication is also to do with the community decision making that occurs, because I spoke to many village members that said, we would really like to resettle, but one of the reasons why we can't is because the village head isn't moving, and due to their custom they could not move before the village head. And as an aside, this community has not in the time of 2017 had not experienced any severe impacts from flooding in living memory, and so didn't have any kind of routine established movements connected to flooding, which is different to the other 2 communities. Unfortunately, that's changed, and they were very badly impacted by the 2019 cyclone Idai related flooding, and have actually had to resettle reactively to this area of land and are quite unhappy with that process. And Tienachakadza, this is an area which is in a kind of marshy land in the middle of a river, in the Shuri River at the far south, and it's subsequently a really fertile area but really vulnerable to flooding. And the government declared this area in 2012 as not fit for human habitation. So there's no health or education services there, and NGOs aren't allowed to go there. So there's quite a lot of pressure on the government to resettle. For residents of this area to access those services, they have to cross the river and travel several kilometers, most often by foot. So it's not necessarily an easy place to live in that respect, but most of the residents that I spoke to from this area had a huge amount of pride of their independence from the government and would not really ever consider resettling, because if they were to resettle, they would want to resettle altogether and be very close to their areas of cultivation in this marshland, and there just isn't really any available land close by to do that. And they also are a community that has always been impacted by flooding, and so they have quite established processes to manage the flooding, and they have this annual movement up to an upperland area during the rainy season, so they feel quite prepared for flooding as well. And then the final example here is Jumbo resettlement site. So this was a community whose village was really badly impacted by the 2015 flooding, and they were displaced to an area And part of their village decided they wanted to return to their area, and then this kind of offshoot decided they couldn't go back. So they spoke to their local government officer who organized this resettlement for them. And that happened in 2015, and when I was there in 2017 and again in 2019, they were having persistent issues of integration and hostility with the host community, because there had been some real things that had not been managed well at the start of that resettlement with regards to aid and assistance that they had received, which had caused real problem with their host community. And because as well, they still cultivate, they still return regularly back to their area where they previously lived for their cultivation, where their previous village head is, and they sort of feel that they're not quite sure where they belong. Do they belong under their previous village head, or do they belong under this new village head where technically they permanently reside? And I think that is really impacting their sense of identity as well. So a strong impression that you get from this data is that there isn't the same understanding or motivations for resettlement. And I like this quote from Snatchakad's resident that talks about everybody failing to understand everybody else. But I think what's also clear is that there are real community needs that come out, and each community has a specific priority that is either stopping the resettlement to happen or stopping it from being successful. And there does seem to be, from the government, there seems to be a recognition and an appreciation of this in some way. There's definitely a greater acceptance of temporary resettlement, and also the inclusion of the host community, particularly after the experience with Jumbo. But what is slightly less clear is whether these community priorities are actually influencing what the government priorities are. And I think this quote kind of explains that a lot better. So it's from a national government employee. It says, yeah, I think that one, meaning temporary resettlement, at least the reluctance would be lower, because you can say, okay, I can still use this land, while saying you should move upland just during the rainy season to save lives and property. But when the rains have gone, maybe in March, you can come down and do your winter cropping, because that is a critical thing for them to do, and that is their livelihood. And maybe later you can say to move permanently away, but just to kind of maintain the buy-in, to motivate them, we can still be using this one, meaning temporary resettlement. And I think that the maintaining the buy-in and the motivating them, to me, it really just made me think that the community priorities or the community needs are almost being included as a means to an end, with the end being the government priorities. So they're definitely being heard and listened to on one level, but whether they're actually impacting what is understood as resettlement is unclear. And I would like to do more research into actually what impact that has as well. But from this, there were just kind of 3 recommendations that came out, which were about more research and better communication and proactive planning. And this is all for a book chapter, which is in a book to be released at the end of the year, titled Global Views on Climate Relocation and Social Justice, Navigating Retreat. So I'll finish there, as I started a bit late, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Hebe, for that presentation. So we have heard a lot so far this morning, and I thank everyone for joining us early on a Thursday morning here. A lot of these themes and issues that we heard in the presentations are quite familiar to the field. We saw a range of research and a range of contexts for the research, and a range including academia, national government, international NGO, non-governmental organization, humanitarian organization, taking a variety of methodologies to approach the question of managed retreat. And we did see, as I said, a number of familiar themes and issues come up. The need for communication from governments, the need for participation and voice for the communities and individuals who are most impacted, the interlinkages and interactions with other related policy areas, including indigenous rights, property rights, housing policy and housing rights, climate change policy, and issues of social equity and climate justice. Throughout, we heard about funding in a variety of different ways, the central role that funding plays, the central role that financing plays, whether that involves financing remaining in place or moving people from one place to another temporarily or permanently. There was also a lot of discussion of the different criteria for decision making, including elements like cost-benefit analysis, climate science and impact modeling, risk modeling, community and individual preferences, as well as, most importantly, I think, and perhaps most pervasively, what we heard throughout the course of the morning so far is the influence of domestic, political, cultural, social, economic, and religious influences and the contexts in which people live, work, and experience their lives, and the role that those factors may play in establishing and implementing criteria for decision making. Another issue that comes up in the governance context quite naturally is the balance of power. The balance of power as between the different scales of government, from the national to the regional, provincial, or state to the hyper-local, and the relationship between those governance structures and community governance, and ultimately the individuals who are being asked to move. Throughout, I was struck by the ways in which how deeply personal this issue is for each individual, and also how individualized the priorities and decision-making processes are for each of the individuals that are impacted. So I thank you all for the presentations, very thought-provoking, and it was great to hear a variety of perspectives and methodologies reflected back on these law and policy and governance questions. So I'm going to dive into a few of the questions that have come up in the chat in the few minutes that we have remaining. I'll start off with a question that was for Thomas. And this question notes that you've highlighted the lack of compensation for homeowners who are asked to or forced to relocate in England and Wales. But some people argue that there is an implied responsibility or liability because local governments have previously given permission to develop on land which is now quote unquote unsafe. Did you hear anything like this in your research or other sorts of perspectives on the issue of local government responsibility or liability and its relationship to compensation?
Thanks a lot. Yes, I heard quite a lot about this issue. In fact, interesting more in Austria than in England and Wales. The main reason is that, for example, in Austria, it's not only that the local planning organization allowed to build there, but also there was the flood regulation from buildings after the 1990s allowed to build there. So it means you got the safe permission by the local government, you get also the safe permission by the regional authorities. And after 2013, this is the last relocation process. Ends up the question, who is responsible for this mess? Who is can we take the court decision or not? And in fact, people didn't know that. And what has happened, if they sign the relocation agreement, they lose the right for liability. So it means there is nobody takes the liability ownership anymore. And it's huge, very, very creating a lot of conflicts, because sometimes also the mayor owns the land beforehand and he sold the land. So as you see, the local level, quite a lot of conflicts, power relationships. Of course, everyone is saying we didn't know that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now it's happened already, but no, it's not true. It's a huge issue, very huge.
Thank you, Thomas. So this is a question for Kanako. How did you measure or evaluate the sense of ownership that you discussed in your paper?
Right. Well, I don't really do very quantitative research. It's more the qualitative questions that I've been asking to people, in particular related to ownership I think the question is something like whether they intend to stay in the community, their intention of what they want to do for the short and medium term development of their community, and how specific they are answering to those questions. And I take those responses to understand how they perceive their community, how they feel that they own their community. So that's the way how I sort of measure them.
Yeah, great, thank you. A difficult thing to measure, no doubt.
Right.
So another question for you, I'll keep you on here for another moment. The sweat equity construction example at Late was an interesting one. What regulations exist, if any, that limit or limited the ability of residents to participate in the construction work? And do you think that this approach is generalizable elsewhere, including where licensing requirements limit who can build housing?
So yes, the sweat equity construction is really interesting. And the only thing that they were asking for was one person from household. And then usually they had male participating to this program because it's a construction work. What was the problem? The problem was that the male are usually the breadwinner of the household. And then, so if they participate in this sweat equity program, they won't be able to go out for fishing, or they won't be able to do the traditional work that they do to continue earning. And then the program would surely last until the time when the construction finishes. So I think it's a concept that's closer to the cash for work, that you, after disaster, you work to clean the community, for example, and you get the cash. But it has some complexity because it's not forever. It only lasts for certain time. So yes, and then lastly, I want to say, often the problem was people who are fishermen, for example, can't really build the houses. They don't know how to do it. So it can only be a very general work, such as making concretes for bricks, and the work that they can do is very limited.
Thank you. So we'll take one last question, and this is a question that goes to one of the things that I noted as well among the presentations is all of the vocabulary. Of course, managed retreat is a contested term. There are a variety of titles that we saw here: managed retreat, planned retreat, slow withdrawal, relocation, resettlement, and throughout the question of whether this is about adaptation, disaster risk reduction, disaster management, disaster recovery, or something else. So this question, Liam, is for you. Is it safe to say that the kind of retreat that you are seeing in Northern Australia is in fact unmanaged retreat rather than managed or planned? Is this notion of slow withdrawal something that might be thought of as unmanaged retreat? Withdrawal of services and the conditions needed for life do not seem to be, at least to the asker of this question, much of a planned or managed approach. Your thoughts on that, please.
It's a good question, Brent, and it's one I've been thinking about this week while I wrote this paper. My quick answer is yes, I agree. It is unmanaged, and it's certainly unmanaged in the sense that the Northern Territory and Commonwealth governments have no policy by any name that is planned or managed or strategic, and all the things we would want to name policies to differentiate them from just approaches to abandonment. In saying that, I guess I think there's a very sort of rationalist approach to policy that I see in some of these discussions. And for me, it's also quite clear that other policies or policies by other names come together to implement strategies which are also desired by governments. So if there are policies which shift the focus of where houses are built to centralised locations, and at the same time, with another hand, increase the sort of punitive approaches to whatever it might be, policing, non-participation in mainstream economies in more remote contexts, then I do think in some ways it's managed retreat by another name. There's a separate conversation there about the politics of what we might want to call it. But I guess I was just trying to think through some of that today. But I'll leave it there.
Great,
Thanks for the
thank you.
question.
Thank you, Liam. Thanks for the questions, Brent and others. All right, well, that is our time for this morning. Let me say thank you once again to our presenters for your sophisticated, fascinating, and important work on these critical issues of law, governance, and policy in the climate migration managed retreat space. I'll let everybody move on to their networking session and to the next presentations that you'll be joining. Thanks so much.